Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says there's an opportunity for a big deal between the U.S. and China to rebalance on trade and make China less dependent on manufacturing exports. Stock market responding favorably to signs that weeks of trade tensions and tariff threats between the world's two largest economies may be easing, the Dow up 400 points. Treasury Secretary also calling for the International Monetary Fund to focus on core missions of economic stability and development and less on things like climate change. Supreme Court hears a case about whether fuel producers can sue the Environmental Protection Agency over it's letting California impose more stringent vehicle emission standards than federal standards to transition from gas to electric cars. President Trump accuses Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky of inflammatory statements that would do nothing but prolong the war with Russia, after Zelensky said his country cannot recognize Russian control of Crimea, the area that Russia annexed in 2014. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick speaks at the annual Holocaust Days of Remembrance ceremony in Washington, saying that President Trump will always stand by Israel and the Jewish people. Vice President J.D. Vance talks about being one of the final public officials to meet with Pope Francis before he died. And Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat of Illinois, the minority whip, says he will not run for re-election in 2026, retiring after 44 years of service in the U.S. House and Senate. Story from Associated Press, U.S. stocks made big gains amid clear signs of relief Wednesday after President Donald Trump said he would not attempt to fire the head of the Federal Reserve, and his Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he expects a de-escalation in what he called an unsustainable tariffs showdown against China. Bessent said in a speech Wednesday morning there's an opportunity for a big deal here. AP writes, China, meanwhile, said the Trump administration to stop trying to bully and blackmail its trading partner. And some on Wall Street expressed skepticism that President Trump is done testing the limits of bellicose rhetoric on trade. Again, that's all from AP. President Trump told reporters outside the White House that trade talks with China are ongoing, and he expects a fair deal will come out of it.
Can you clarify, Mr. President, on China?
Yeah, we are going to have a fair deal with China. It's going to be fair.
Are you talking to them actively now?
Actively. Everything's active. Everybody wants to be a part of what we're doing. They know that they can't get away with it any longer, but they're still going to do fine. And we're going to have a country that you can be proud of, not a laughingstock all over the world for many years.
President Donald Trump speaking to reporters outside the White House. The story from Axios, President Trump got a scare from CEOs and markets on Monday. On Tuesday, he blunted some of his sharpest threats, signaling a softer stance on China and retreating from fiery rhetoric targeting the Fed. The president is resolute in his goal of reshaping the economy, but he's sensitive to the movement of the markets and the pleas of powerful corporate leaders and investors who fear the worst from his sweeping efforts. Monday was a tough day for Trump's goal of reshaping the global economy. The CEOs of three of the nation's biggest retailers, Walmart, Target, and Home Depot, privately warned him that his tariff and trade policy could disrupt supply chains, raise prices, and empty shelves, according to sources familiar with the meeting. That's the story from Axios. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talked about tariffs in China today at a forum in Washington hosted by the Institute of International Finance.
In response to President Trump's tariff announcements, more than 100 countries have approached us, wanting to help rebalance global trade. These countries have responded openly and positively to the president's actions to create a more balanced international system. We are engaged in meaningful discussions and look forward to talking with others. China in particular is in need of a rebalancing. Recent data shows the Chinese economy tilting even further away from consumption toward manufacturing. China's economic system, with growth driven by manufacturing exports, will continue to create even more serious imbalances with its trading partners if the status quo is allowed to continue. China's current economic model is built on exporting its way out of its economic troubles. It's an unsustainable model that is not only harming China, but the entire world. China needs to change. The country knows it needs to change. Everyone knows it needs to change, and we want to help it change because we need rebalancing too. China can start by moving its economy away from export overcapacity and towards supporting its own consumers and domestic demand. Such a shift would help with global rebalancing that the world desperately needs.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent at the Institute of International Finance Global Outlook Forum in Washington. Story from CNN, 12 states sued the Trump administration Wednesday for, quote, illegally imposing tax hikes on Americans through tariffs. The president imposed the tariffs through the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives the president the authority to enact those powers in response to unusual and extraordinary threats. The lawsuit seeks a court order to halt the tariffs under that act, saying that the president does not have the authority he claims he does. That was from CNN, and this is separate from a lawsuit already filed by California over tariffs. More from the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about tariffs and China at that Institute of International Finance Forum in Washington.
China obviously is an important part of this administration's foreign and economic policy. You'll be meeting with your Chinese counterparts. What will you tell them in the sense of how they obviously are aware that there's huge imbalances, their manufacturing capacity is enormous, especially in things like automobiles. How will you help them understand that it's not just about talking, it's about executing?
Well, look, I don't think I have to help them understand. I think they understand very well. And it's just a matter of impetus and will. So I believe I first went to Japan in 1990, 91, within 12 months of the peak of the bubble. A decade of that unwind, a decade of malaise. And then in 2012, I ran across a fellow, 2011, who was running for prime minister, named Shinzo Abe, and he knew that Japan needed change and implemented it very quickly. 10 years later, more than 10 years later, Japan has had a remarkable economic run, and I think that our Chinese counterparts that will come to this realization, and if some of our policies, sometimes it takes an external push.
Right.
Alternatively, what I have said previously, there is an opportunity for a big deal here, that the U.S. is looking to rebalance to more manufacturing. The identity of that would be less consumption. If China is serious on less dependence on export-led manufacturing growth and a rebalancing toward a domestic economy, I think they use the term dual circulation. Right. Well, right now it's really singular circulation. And if they want to rebalance, let's do it together. This is an incredible opportunity. And I think if Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio were to write something, he could call it a beautiful rebalancing.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent interviewed at the Institute of International Finance Global Outlook Forum in Washington. Earlier in the day, Wall Street Journal reporting that the Trump administration is considering slashing its steep tariffs on Chinese imports, in some cases by more than half, in a bid to de-escalate tensions with Beijing that have roiled global trade and investment, according to people familiar with the matter. But later, the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said on Fox News, "Let me be clear, there will be no unilateral reduction in tariffs against China. The president has made it clear that China needs to make a deal with the United States of America, and we are optimistic that will happen." We'll have more on tariffs and China coming up in just a moment. But first, Secretary Bessent brought up another issue at this forum. As the New York Times reports, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Wednesday called for major overhauls to the missions of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but said that the United States remained committed to maintaining its leadership role at the global economic institutions. The comments, made at a speech on the sidelines of the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, come at a moment of concern among policymakers that the Trump administration could withdraw the United States entirely from the fund and the bank. That was from the New York Times. Here is the Treasury Secretary.
First, we must make the IMF again. The IMF's mission is to promote international monetary cooperation, facilitate the balanced growth of international trade, encourage economic growth, and discourage harmful policies like competitive exchange rate depreciation. These are crucially important functions to support the U.S. and global economies. Instead, the IMF has suffered from mission creep. The IMF was once unwavering in its mission of promoting global monetary cooperation and financial stability. Now it devotes disproportionate time and resources to work on climate change, gender, and social issues. These issues are not the IMF's mission. And the IMF's focus in these areas is crowding out its work on critical macroeconomic issues. The IMF must be a brutal truth teller and not just to some members. Today, the IMF has been whistling past the graveyard. Its 2024 external sector report was entitled Imbalances Receding. This Pollyannish outlook is symptomatic of an institution more dedicated to preserving the status quo than answering the hard questions. Here in the United States, we know we need to get our fiscal house in order. The last administration ran up the largest peacetime deficit in our nation's history. The current administration is committed to fixing this. We are open to critique, but we will not abide the IMF failing to critique the countries that most need it, principally surplus countries. In line with its core mandate, the IMF needs to call out countries like China that have pursued globally distorted policies and opaque currency practices for many decades. I also expect the IMF to call out unsustainable lending practices by certain creditor countries. The IMF should push more proactively official bilateral lenders to come to the table early to work with borrower countries to minimize periods of debt distress. The IMF must refocus its lending on addressing balance of payment problems, and its lending should be temporary. When done responsibly, IMF lending is at the very core of its contribution to the global economy. When markets fail, the IMF steps in and makes resources available. In exchange, countries implement economic reforms to resolve their balance of payments issues and support economic growth. The reforms undertaken during these programs are some of the IMF's most important contributions to a strong, sustainable, and balanced global economy.
The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent at the Institute of International Finance Forum in Washington. A recent Reuters article on the speculation the U.S. could pull its support from the IMF and World Bank had this: a founding member, the United States holds the largest single share of each institution, just over 16% for the IMF and just under that for the World Bank. This has given U.S. policymakers strong influence over decision-making that global economic leaders have come to rely on. U.S. withdrawal would also surprise experts and investors, as the institutions give Washington that influence at a relatively low cost, and stepping back, they say, would be a gift to China and others seeking to dislodge it as the global leader. That was from Reuters. This is Washington Today, and now back to tariffs, trade, and China. Congressman French Hill, Republican of Arkansas, chair of the Financial Services Committee, was at the same forum as the Treasury Secretary and was asked what his constituents are telling him.
Obviously, a lot of volatility in the markets. The last couple of days have been much better, but since January, we've seen sell-off in all the major indices. A lot of concern about slowing growth, forecasts for potential recession. What are you hearing when you go back to Little Rock? What are the people on the street of Little Rock telling you about their view about the markets, the economy, and are they concerned?
Well, for the decade that I've been in Congress, before I was in Congress, I was a banker in Little Rock, my hometown. I was the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, very involved in economic affairs in my home state. And for the decade, the number one complaint's always been finding the right talent from a human resources point of view to carry out whatever the mission of the business is. And that continues to be the top concern there is workforce, whether it's white collar, cyber, engineering, healthcare, or logistics. But uncertainty is, risen to the top in the last few weeks over the tariff strategy of the administration. Because 30% of our output in Arkansas goes to Canada and Mexico, I have enormous international companies in my district, many from France, but from around the world. We're a capital city. We're a logistics hub in the Mid-South, and so it's a busy place. And people want certainty, and I think that has risen to the top, one of the top concerns. I met with a lot of my major industries last week when I was in Little Rock. I had both steel fabrication and production, as well as retailing and everything in between. And we talked specifically about what their outlook is for 2025, how they're anticipating their business strategies to cope with this very back and forth, on again, off again tariff point of view. So this is something that I would urge the president to resolve quickly, because on regulation, we're moving in the right direction. Rebalancing, tailoring. On taxes, Congress will meet next week and start budget reconciliation, where we're going to work hard to commit that small businesses, entrepreneurs, families are not going to have a tax increase at the end of the year. We want to give predictability to that, and that we are going to drop the slope of the rapid growth of spending coming out of the Biden administration, the pandemic, where we just went out of control in federal spending. So regulation going in the right direction. Spending and taxes, in my judgment, could be going in the right direction. Those are good things. So we want to get the trade issue in the right direction, in the right groove, and make sure it's producing results for the economy and for all of our citizens, so that good news is not stepped on by less successful.
Congressman French Hill, Republican from Arkansas, chair of the Financial Services Committee, today in Washington at a forum hosted by the Institute of International Finance. A recent article from The Guardian reads that Donald Trump's tariffs will send international trade into reverse this year, depressing global economic growth, the World Trade Organization has warned. In its latest snapshot of the global trading system, the Geneva-based institution says it had previously expected goods trade to expand by a healthy 2.7% this year. As a result of Washington's trade policy, it is now forecasting a 0.2% decline. Presenting the forecast, the WTO's Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, said she was particularly concerned about the decoupling of the U.S. and China, calling it a phenomenon that is really worrying to me. That was from the Guardian newspaper article. That WTO Director General expanded upon that today in Washington at an event hosted by the Council on Foreign Relations.
Is it, you see like two parents fighting, and your job is to protect the children and make sure not too much crockery is broken?
Two parents fighting. Two children. Okay, I don't know which analogy to use. No, but the greatest concern we have, and I've said this openly, is the potential decoupling of U.S. China trade with the level of tariffs that we are seeing between the two. So today was a little bit of a breather and good news that there's light at the end of the tunnel with respect to, not decoupling. But decoupling is a serious concern to us, and the creation of two potential trading blocs, one aligned with the U.S. and one maybe with China, maybe a few in the middle. But two trading blocs is very, very fraught for us, because we've modeled that, and we actually sounded the alarm on trade fragmentation earlier on, a year ago, when we looked at our World Trade Report. And we found that if the world breaks into two geopolitical trading blocs, we are going to lose 7% of global GDP in the longer term. This is huge. And there will be double-digit losses for developing countries, welfare losses. So this is even worse. So this is why when I'm asked what was or has been, or is the biggest worry, it is the decoupling of China. China-US trade is 3% of world trade. So when you look at that, it's small. But the potential of these two big trading partners split and then being able to persuade and create these blocks has such negative impact on world trade and therefore on world growth as well. So this is what we're worried about. And hearing the new noises and the new statements today that there's room for China and the U.S. to still negotiate, and also that, potentially decoupling is not in the best interest. And, I also had a session with Ambassador Greer yesterday. So that was also a little bit comforting that, there may be ways for the two to get to talk to each other and to avoid this situation. That would be very good for the world.
World Trade Organization Director General Nkosi Okonjo-Iweala at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Wall Street today, the Dow up 419, NASDAQ up 407, S&P up 88. CNN reports that Elon Musk says he's going back to Tesla. The question now is whether or not it is too late to reverse the damage that's been done. Musk told investors on Tuesday night he would step back from his role running the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, next month, spending only 1 or 2 days a week there. He said he would spend the freed up time running Tesla, but even if Musk devotes more time to the now troubled company, it's clear that his high-profile support of President Donald Trump and the controversial role of DOGE has already cost Tesla. There have been protests outside showrooms and vandalism at its facilities. Earlier this month, the automaker reported the biggest drop in sales in its history during the first quarter as buyers fled the brand, and that damage could be long-lasting, even according to some of his fans. That was from CNN. Federal spending cuts was the main topic of a community conversation hosted today by Democratic Congresswoman Terry Sewell in Fort Deposit, Alabama. Here's part of it as she talks about the Trump administration's decision to cut a local water sewage program because it was deemed to be DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
In the letter, the termination letter that the Department of Justice issued, it called the agreement a DEI agreement. Diversity, equity, and inclusion agreement. Now, I said at the outset, this is not about diversity, some initiative that's about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Rather, it's a public health crisis. It's about a basic human right. Everyone, especially in this great country we live in, no one should have raw sewage in their front yard, period, full stop. So this is not about that, but they did this administration categorized that agreement as a DEI agreement. And we do know that that diversity, equity, and inclusion is under attack and under assault by this administration. And unfortunately, even the word diversity, equity, inclusion, it's as if, Elon Musk and his DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency is what it's called. What they're doing is literally word searching diversity, equity, inclusion, and just terminating programs and attacking programs that just have those words in it, and not evaluating whether or not these are programs that are actually delivering awesome outcomes that are effectuating our well-being as people. And they're not taking that seriously. And so we have to push back on that. We saw that not just in the area of wastewater with this agreement, we saw it in other areas as well. You will recall that they terminated the Tuskegee Airmen part of the Air Force manual because they said it dealt with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about Black history. That's proud Alabama history and proud American history. And when we push back against them on that, they restored it. I guess what I'm saying is we all know, and none of us want inefficiency or ineffective government. None of us want that. No one wants waste, fraud, and abuse. Let me just say that. We want effective government. But there's a way to go about doing this. And unfortunately, this administration has a chainsaw approach. They're cutting everything and wondering if it will stick. So we have to amplify our voices as American citizens to push back when we see injustice, when we see things that are being terminated that shouldn't be terminated.
Congresswoman Terry Sewell, a Democrat in Fort Deposit, Alabama, part of her annual Congress in Your Community tour of each of the counties in Alabama's 7th congressional district. Story from Newsweek. A group of attorneys general have hypothesized about President Donald Trump trying to remove high-ranking judges like U.S. Supreme Court justices in a letter supporting two Federal Trade Commission commissioners' lawsuit against their own removal. Commissioners Rebecca Kelly Slaughter and Alvaro Bedoya, both Democrats, are suing President Trump and his administration over the president's efforts to remove them from their posts last month. The pair argue the president lacks the authority to fire them in an amicus brief filed on Friday. Senior Democratic state legal officials, including attorneys general from Washington, Minnesota, Colorado, and Illinois, compared the firing to Trump removing Article 3 judges, a group that includes the high court justices. That was from Newsweek. Alvaro Bedoya was on a panel today at the Center for American Progress in Washington, talking about whether the president can fire him and others in similar situations.
I just arrived at my daughter's gymnastics class right after work on a Tuesday, and my daughter gets really annoyed when I'm not watching her do gymnastics because she'll do a really good trick and then she'll look over, and if I'm on my phone like an idiot, she gets really mad. And so I was like very insistently watching her, and then I got a call from Commissioner Slaughter who said, "Hey Alvaro, have you checked your phone?" And I said, "Actually, I haven't checked my phone." She said, "You should check your phone because the president's trying to fire you and me, or trying to fire me. Do you have the same email?" And I said, "Checked it. In fact, I do." How are we handling it? I think this is really. I'll tell you how we're handling it, and I'll tell you why I think it's important. Why we did what we did. So it's our position. We're still commissioners, and it's, I don't have access to Westlaw. I don't have access to Lexis. I don't have access to all of my files. But Commissioner Slaughter and I are insistent on doing the aspects of our job that we can still do. So we are meeting with, the day after I got quote unquote fired, I met with rideshare drivers in Denver, Colorado, who are being ripped off. We will soon meet with some fishermen in the Northeast. We'll soon meet with some small business leaders. We issued a statement on what DOJ appears to be, what we're worried about DOJ doing at the Federal Trade Commission. And I think it's important to do this for a couple of reasons. One of them is, as we are learning, when, I think one way to put it is, when disorder happens, most good people say, "Oh, this is disorder. I'm going to respond in an orderly way. I'm going to try to take the temperature down and respond by just saying, oh, I'm just going to keep my head down and let's be done with this." I think it's really important to meet disorder with disorder and not accept the terms that are being put upon you if those terms are overtly illegal, and not accept the reality that people are trying to create if it flies in the face of a century of American law. And so that's what we're trying to do.
And not just a century of American law, but Supreme Court jurisprudence as well.
Correct. And let me explain to the degree that we're doing this. I don't think an FTC commissioners are not supposed to draw outside income, right? And so I am burning through my family savings in order to continue to abide by the ethics rules that apply to me. There's a limit to this, right? I can't do this forever, but that is how I am trying to continue to do my job. And that's why we also thought it was very important to openly say this is opening the door to corruption. This is not about us. This is about the billionaires over the president's shoulder at the inauguration. And I think that I think all of those things are important to not just go along, but to abide by the law.
Alvaro Bedoya, Federal Trade Commissioner, Democrat from 2022 until he was fired by President Trump on March 18th of this year. As you heard him say, he still considers himself a commissioner as he's pursuing legal challenges. Today at the Center for American Progress in Washington on a panel discussion about the powers of the president to remove independent agency officials. Story from Politico. New York City Mayor Eric Adams and President Trump's border czar Tom Homan ratcheted up their case Tuesday for cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration officials when they announced the indictment of 27 alleged Tren de Aragua members and associates on racketeering, narcotics, sex trafficking, and robbery charges. Tom Homan was asked about that today as he spoke to reporters in the White House driveway.
Mr. Homan, Tom Dempsey with News Nation. Can you give us an update on the crackdown in New York City of Tren de Aragua members?
That's a classic example of how collaboration between ICE and state and local law enforcement, the success of the collaboration. 27 Tren de Aragua people were indicted. I believe 6 are still outstanding. We're looking for that. But we send a strong message to Tren de Aragua. We're going to keep doing this to every TDA member and MS-13 members we move from the country. That was the first time we used RICO. The underlying offenses were sex trafficking, gun trafficking, drug trafficking, murder for hire. We seized a lot of weapons and we rescued some victims of sex trafficking. What's specifically important to me about New York is Mayor Adams, who's getting beat up by the left for cooperating with us. Look what transpired. Look at the lives we saved in New York City, right? At the same time, you got the city council filed a lawsuit to shut down our memorandum of understanding, the executive order he signed to get us in Rikers Island. We proved yesterday what collaboration can do for the safety and security in New York. But now the city council wants to lock us out of Rikers Island where TDA and MS-13 housed so we can get custody of them before they hit the streets in New York. It's just ridiculous. And of course, no city council members at the press conference yesterday, they don't want to hear the truth. This is about open borders. This is about sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities are for criminals. And I salute Mayor Adams for, writing that executive order to get us in Rikers Island. I think we'll win that case. I hope the judge who's going to hear that case saw the press conference yesterday and see the results of collaboration. Cops should be working with a cop. I never asked New York City NYPD to be an immigration officer. Ask them to help us be cops working with cops to remove public safety threats and national security threats and terrorists from the streets of New York and from Rikers Island when they're done with their sentences. That's exactly what we proved yesterday.
Border czar in the Trump administration, Tom Homan, speaking to reporters in the White House driveway. Associated Press reports that the Trump administration on Wednesday continued to resist a federal judge's orders to produce information about the steps it has taken, if any, to return a Maryland man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador. Drew Ensign, a deputy assistant attorney general, filed a sealed motion asking for a stay of the judge's order to provide sworn testimony and documents about the U.S. government's efforts to retrieve Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The request comes just hours after U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes in Maryland had castigated the Trump administration in a written filing Tuesday for ignoring her orders, obstructing the legal process, and acting in bad faith by refusing to provide information. Reporting from AP. The Supreme Court, writes CNN, indicated Wednesday that it will revive a lawsuit from fuel producers challenging California's strict vehicle emissions rules, with both conservative and liberal justices signaling that the companies have standing to sue. Several of the justices suggested a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. erred when it barred the fuel makers' suit on the theory that market forces are driving the national push toward electric vehicles far more than California's tough regulations. That was from CNN. The case is Diamond Alternative Energy v. EPA. Here's part of the oral argument. Justices Clarence Thomas and Elena Kagan questioning Edwin Needler, U.S. Deputy Solicitor General.
Wasn't the goal of the California regulations to reduce the use of petitioners' fuel?
Certainly in 2013, when it was adopted, and I think this is an important point, in 2013, where the fuel producers were already selling in the market, it would have been, I think, quite easy to show that their injury derived from this new regulation. It was caused by that regulation, and it would be redressed by lifting it. It's now 10 years later, though, that manufacturers and no one else challenged the waiver in 2013. In the meantime, there has been 10 years of practical experience in which manufacturers have adjusted and quite without regard or without resting upon the California rule.
But when EPA reinstated the rule in 2022, was it intended to do nothing at all?
No, not at all. I think on that point, I think it's important to understand the legal rationale or the legal analysis that EPA brought to bear. And this is something on which there has been changes from one administration to the next, and that's under review. But a waiver in the approach that EPA was taking is for the entire California program, not just these two particular standards. So a waiver is for the entire program, and if the entire program is necessary to address compelling and extraordinary circumstances, that's sufficient. But another important point is that
in 2022, didn't the EPA, in fact, in its submissions to the courts, say that the effect of the reinstatement was going to be to reduce gasoline emissions?
They said that in 2021, based, frankly, I think on 2019 projections. A lot happened especially in the zero emission vehicle market.
So we shouldn't take the EPA's own representation seriously?
Oh, it was California, but
I think both EPA and California made those representations in its papers.
Well, yes, but was that sufficient? The evidence, as you said, is pretty thin, and it's also important to recognize what
if it was so thin, I don't think that you had a grounds to reinstate the waiver.
Justice Elena Kagan and Justice Clarence Thomas questioning Edwin Needler, U.S. Deputy Solicitor General, in the Supreme Court oral argument today, the case Diamond Alternative Energy v. EPA. Again, from the CNN article about the oral argument. Given California's size, automakers have for decades hewed to the state's tighter emissions controls, which are permitted under an on-again, off-again EPA waiver. Democratic presidents have supported the waiver, while President Donald Trump has not. The Supreme Court specifically declined to review the broader legality of the waiver, denying an appeal in December that raised that very question. Instead, the court agreed to decide if the fuel polluters, as a function of selling less fuel because more electric vehicles are on the road, were injured by the EPA's waiver. That was from CNN, and you can find the full oral argument at our website, cspan.org. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Democracy. It isn't just an idea. It's a process shaped by leaders elected to the highest offices and entrusted to a select few with guarding its basic principles. It's where debates unfold, decisions are made, and the nation's course is charted. Democracy in real time. This is your government at work. This is C-SPAN, giving you your democracy unfiltered.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, writes the Washington Post, insisted Wednesday that Russia must accept a full ceasefire before negotiations, thwarting U.S. efforts to gain quick concessions from Kyiv. As President Donald Trump said, the Ukrainian leader's options were either peace now or the eventual loss of his country. Trump accused Zelensky on Wednesday of boasting after the Ukrainian leader told reporters the day before that Kyiv will never recognize Crimea as Russian. President Trump, writing on Truth Social, he can have peace or he can fight for another 3 years before losing the whole country. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done. Article from the Washington Post continues. U.S. officials presented a proposal last week that apparently included leaving Russia with 20% of the Ukrainian land it now occupies, while also denying Ukraine NATO membership and security guarantees. It also offered U.S. recognition of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, as well as the eventual lifting of sanctions. Trump wrote Wednesday that despite Zelensky's comments, Washington is not asking Ukraine to recognize Crimea as Russian. That was from the Washington Post. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt answered a reporter's question on this today in the White House driveway.
We just heard from President Trump on Truth Social talking about Zelensky in the Wall Street Journal article that just came out. Has the U.S. asked Ukraine to give up Crimea as part of this negotiation for a peace? And also, will he be meeting with Zelensky in Rome this weekend?
Well, as President Trump rightfully pointed out in that statement, it was President Obama who gave up Crimea, who allowed Russia to take it over in 2014. And so the president is not asking Ukraine to recognize Crimea. Nobody has asked them to do that. What he is asking is for people to come to the negotiating table recognizing that this has been a brutal war for far too long. And in order to make a good deal, both sides have to walk away a little bit unhappy. And unfortunately, President Zelensky has been trying to litigate this peace negotiation in the press. And that's unacceptable to the president. These should be closed-door negotiations. The president's national security team, his advisors, have exuded significant time, energy, and effort to try to bring this war to an end. The American taxpayer has funded billions of dollars in this effort, and enough is enough. The president's frustrated. His patience is running very thin. He wants to do what's right for the world. He wants to see peace. He wants to see the killing stop. But you need both sides of the war willing to do that. And unfortunately, President Zelensky seems to be moving in the wrong direction.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt with reporters in the White House driveway. More from the Washington Post article. Lower-level talks took place Wednesday in London, but the foreign minister-level meeting isn't happening, said a diplomat familiar with the talks who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe the internal deliberations after Secretary of State Marco Rubio canceled and other foreign ministers followed suit. Rubio had been scheduled to fly to London on Tuesday night. Steve Witkoff, a special envoy and close ally of President Trump's, who is central to White House efforts to broker an end to the war, also dropped out. He will head to Moscow this week, according to the Russians. That was from the Washington Post. The annual Holocaust Days of Remembrance ceremony held today in the U.S. Capitol, led by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, honoring the victims of the Holocaust and other victims of Nazi persecution before and during World War II. One of the speakers, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who is Jewish.
I'm here to tell you in very, very clear and plain language, President Trump will never back down from defending the Jewish people. Never. And President Trump stands shoulder to shoulder with the people and the state of Israel. Colleges and universities that enable anti-Semitism, they will lose our government's support. The Trump administration will not protect institutions that protect hate. This administration's promise is real. It matters, and it's not going anywhere. This country stands with the Jewish people, not just in words, but in the actions that we take. Our administration is clear. Hate and anti-Semitism have no place in America. We are all honored to be standing beside our incredible survivors who are with us today. Thank you for honoring us. We remember the Holocaust and its horrors together. And we stand together with the Trump administration. All of us stand against hate, and we stand against anti-Semitism. Thank you for honoring me today by having me here.
Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick at the Holocaust Days of Remembrance in the U.S. Capitol. The ceremony also included personal reflections by Holocaust survivors. One was Abraham Foxman, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council member.
The Holocaust teaches us many lessons about the fragility of democracy, the dangers of anti-Semitism. But it also teaches us that choice is always possible, that silence is a choice, and choices always have consequences. Individuals have more power than they think. We survivors hope that more people will use that power to confront anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. That is our hope and our challenge to all of you on this very special day and on every day. May we all choose wisely. We live in very chaotic times where our values, our history, our democracy are being tested. As a survivor, I'm horrified at the explosion of anti-Semitism, global and in the U.S. And I'm appreciative of President Biden's historic initiative on anti-Semitism and thankful to President Trump's strong condemnation of anti-Semitism and his promise to bring back consequences to anti-Semitic behavior. But as a survivor, my antenna quiver. My antenna quiver when I see books being banned, when I see people being abducted in the streets, when I see government trying to dictate what universities should teach and whom they should teach. As a survivor who came to this country as an immigrant, I'm troubled when I hear immigrants and immigration being demonized.
Abraham Foxman, Holocaust survivor, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council member, and former director of ADL, Anti-Defamation League, speaking today at the Holocaust Days of Remembrance ceremony in the U.S. Capitol in Washington. On the subject of universities, story from UPI, President Donald Trump on Wednesday signed an executive order that targets the college accreditation process, including encouraging competition in the process. Accreditation process is linked to colleges and universities accessing federal money for student loans and Pell Grants. The schools depend on grants besides tuition and for public schools, state funding. Will Scharf, the White House staff secretary, said university accreditation is currently a process controlled by a number of third-party organizations. That's by statute, by law. Many of those third-party creditors have relied on sort of woke ideology to accredit universities instead of accrediting based on merit and performance. That was from UPI. From Associated Press, Catholic cardinals performed the ritual ceremony to transfer Pope Francis to St. Peter's Basilica, where he'll lie in state for the Catholic faithful to pay their respects to the Argentine pontiff. The 3 days of public viewing are largely for ordinary Catholics to grieve the 88-year-old Pope who died Monday after suffering a stroke. Citing the elevated turnout of faithful paying their respects, the Vatican said Wednesday it may keep St. Peter's Basilica open past midnight. That was from AP. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance was one of the last public officials to meet the Pope on Easter Sunday before he passed away. Today, the Vice President spoke about it as he answered reporters' questions at the airport in Agra, India. He and his family are on a 4-day visit to that country.
Pope obviously passed away a few days ago.
Yeah.
Are you planning to attend his funeral?
So I'm not currently planning to attend his funeral. I'm not currently planning to not attend his funeral. We just haven't really thought that much about when his funeral is going to be and who's going to attend from our government. I mean, let me just say a couple of words about the Holy Father. Obviously, I was able to see him very briefly the morning of Easter Sunday. I knew he was very ill. I didn't realize how sick he was. The thing that I will always remember Pope Francis for is that he was a great pastor. People on the margins, poor people, people suffering from diseases, they saw in Pope Francis an advocate and I think a true expression of Christian love. So we're very saddened by it. Obviously, our condolences to the Catholics all over the world, but especially back home who loved and honored the Holy Father.
What does it feel like knowing you were maybe one of the last officials to meet with him before he died?
Yeah, you know, I've thought a lot about that. I mean, it's pretty crazy, actually. And obviously, when I saw him, I didn't know that he had less than 24 hours still on this earth. I think it was a great blessing. But, you know, I think he saw a lot of people. I think he affected a lot of lives. And I try to just, you know, remember that I was lucky that I got to shake his hand and tell him that I pray for him every day because I did and I do.
In his final Easter message that the Archbishop read in St. Peter's Square, you know, he talked about not stirring up contempt against the vulnerable and migrants and the logic of fear not being something world leaders should yield to. Do you have any thoughts on that? And has his death caused you at all to reflect on the policies of the Trump administration in any new way?
Well, I think that obviously a lot of people, especially in the American press, want to make the Holy Father, his entire legacy, and even his death about American politics. I think it was obviously a much broader figure than the United States of America. He represents over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. Yes, I'm aware that he had some disagreements with some of the policies of our administration. He also had a lot of agreements with some of the policies of our administration. I'm not going to soil the man's legacy by talking about politics. I think he was a great Christian pastor, and that's how I choose to remember the Holy Father.
Would you like to see the next pope continue in the direction that Francis took the church, or would you like a more traditional path?
I won't pretend to give guidance to the cardinals on who they should select as the next pope. We've got plenty of issues to focus on in the United States. I'll just say a prayer for wisdom, because I obviously want them to pick the right person. I want them to pick somebody who will be good for the world's Catholics. But I'll let them make that decision, and obviously they're entitled to do so.
Vice President J.D. Vance speaking to reporters at the airport in Agra, India, as he and his family continue their visit to that country. From Fox News, Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat of Illinois, the Senate Democratic whip and the top Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, has announced he will not seek re-election in 2026. Durbin, 80 years old, was first elected to the Senate in 1996, made the announcement in a video message on X Wednesday. That was from Fox News. Here's the message.
The decision of whether to run for re-election has not been easy. I truly love the job of being United States Senator, but in my heart, I know it's time to pass the torch. So I'm announcing today that I will not be seeking re-election at the end of my term. The people of Illinois have honored me with this responsibility longer than anyone elected to the Senate in our state's history. I'm truly grateful. Right now, the challenges facing our country are historic and unprecedented. The threats to our democracy and way of life are very real, and I can assure you I'll do everything in my power to fight for Illinois and the future of our country every day of my remaining time in the Senate. I've given over half of my life to House and Senate congressional service. I've always tried to stand up to power on behalf of the people of Illinois and our country, but none of it would have been possible without my wife, Loretta, our kids, Christine, Paul, and Jennifer, and my energetic and amazing grandchildren, as well as my extended family. They stood with me and accepted the demands of my public career. I've been blessed to have them, as well as the best Senate staff anyone could ask for. My Senate colleague, Tammy Duckworth, is a trusted friend and an effective leader. She'll be a real asset to Illinois and the nation as our state's senior senator. We're also fortunate to have a strong Democratic bench ready to serve. We need them now more than ever. To the Illinoisans who gave this kid from East St. Louis a chance to serve, thank you for supporting me through the words and actions over the years. Now that I have this announcement behind me, I need to get back to work.
Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, in a video announcing he will not run for a sixth Senate term in 2026. From the Fox News article, Senator Durbin becomes the fourth Democrat in the Senate whose term is up at the end of next year who decided against seeking re-election in the 2026 midterm, joining Senators Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, Gary Peters of Michigan, and Tina Smith of Minnesota. Additionally, Democratic Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado, who isn't up for re-election until 2028, announced last week that he'll run for governor next year. Also, a statement from former President Barack Obama that said, in part, "It's true, I would not have been a U.S. Senator and certainly would not have been president had it not been for Dick's support. He has been a great and loyal friend, and Michelle and I wish him and Loretta all the best in their next chapter." And finally, on C-SPAN Radio, USA Today reports that President Donald Trump has his eyes set on two beautiful poles to display the American flag on the White House grounds. President Trump scouted one location for what he described as nearly 100-foot flagpoles on Wednesday during a surprise visit with a handful of staff members to the White House North Lawn. He said he's planning to have an identical flagpole installed on the south side of the White House campus. That was from USA Today. Here's the president speaking with reporters about it.
We thought you said you were going up to the lawn for a flag. What was going on?
We're putting up a beautiful, almost 100-foot tall American flag on this side and another one on the other side, two flags, top of the line. And they've needed flagpoles for 200 years. It was something I've often said, you know, they don't have a flagpole per se. So we're putting one right where you saw us, and we're putting another one on the other side on top of the mounds. It's going to be two beautiful poles. Paid for by Trump.
When are the flags?
They arrive in about a week or so.
President Donald Trump speaking to reporters outside the White House. Currently, the most prominent American flag at the White House is on top of the building. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.